Well, it's time for our news headlines here on Morning Live. Leaders of the group of 20 major economies opened talks on the Indonesian island of Bali. And we are going to take you there now. Just as we get into all of that. And the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, has arrived in Bali. He arrived there yesterday for the annual summit, which is expected to be overshadowed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And for now, we cross to our correspondent, Richard Kimber, who's watching this one for us. Richard, good morning and good to see you. But of course, much anticipation in terms of what is happening here this morning.
Certainly, this is being dubbed by some as the most diplomatically divisive G20 in recent memory because of issues such as you mentioned of the Russia invasion of Ukraine really dominating the talking points. It's certainly been the main talking point this morning as events have gotten underway on Tuesday. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has just in the past hour delivered a virtual address to all leaders of the G20 nations, during which he has pointedly referred to the G19 rather than the G20 in his address, of course, deliberately excluding Russia from his remarks due to his frustrations over the lack of action on Russia's part to try to de-escalate the military situation in Ukraine. Russia, of course, is not even represented here properly at the G20 as President Vladimir Putin has chosen not to attend. Instead, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is here, an anomaly really among many of the other countries that, of course, have their presidents or prime ministers in attendance. But it's certainly been the main talking point, and there's a real sense of international determination on the part of the other 19 nations to put pressure on the Russian foreign minister over the issue of Russia's continued military activities in Ukraine.
Richard, that being said, though, is there consensus among the other members in the group in terms of the message that needs to be sent out to Russia?
Well, largely there is. There have been problems in this regard with comments, for example, from China and India, two of the biggest economies and biggest players at the G20, who have been less willing to criticize Russia openly and have been less willing to join in the international condemnation of what Russia has been doing. There was some sign of change, though, on Monday during a 3-hour meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, in which they both pledged to have more cooperation on international affairs and both committed to the idea that any kind of nuclear action taken by Russia or indeed any country in the world should be roundly condemned, increasing the sense that perhaps China might start to flex its muscles towards Russia more than it has been in the past. And this G20 platform could be the means by which that starts to take place.
Richard, also COP27 currently underway, and of course looking at the G20, they obviously need to be showing the way here in terms of some of the funding that needs to happen for some transitions in certain countries. How far up on the agenda would this climate change issue be?
Well, I'd say that's certainly really number 2 on the agenda right now, and it's being pushed by South Africa's president, of course, Cyril Ramaphosa. He's been speaking this morning as part of his first chance to air his views on where the summit should go. He's talked of the need for a true commitment to the pledges made under COP27, specifically for South Africa and for all African countries who he says are really bearing the brunt of what's been a far more difficult thing for them to deal with global food inflation and the global crisis really with regards to food supply and energy shortages. I spoke to South Africa's Minister for International Communication, Grace Pandor, yesterday ahead of this summit, and she said it's absolutely crucial during these next 2 days that the voice of African nations and the voice of developing countries around the world are not drowned out by these talk of Russia and Ukraine.
You mentioned there the voice of Africa, South Africa, of course, being the only African country in that group of 20 nations. And just as far as that is concerned, how does Africa's voice come through apart from South Africa, which obviously has its own issues? Has there been any indication of that so far, Richard?
Well, I put this question directly to Minister Pandor yesterday and asked her whether or not she feels now is the time to push for more African representation. There has been some talk of turning the G20 into a G21 and including a membership from the African Union to represent all countries other than South Africa, and somewhat thereby take the pressure off South Africa from necessarily having to constantly represent the African continent at the G20, and perhaps then allow President Ramaphosa or whoever holds that office to focus more specifically on South African issues rather than necessarily continental African issues every time they attend these types of summits. That would be welcomed by Minister Pandor and surely by the rest of the South African delegation. There have been opportunities for the African Union to come and take part in what's called observers status at these G20 summits in the past, and that's likely to continue. But there are calls not just from South Africa but also from other international political academics saying that the sheer population of the African continent and its contribution to global GDP necessitates some revision to this G20 structure to make sure that at future summits there is a better and clearer representation for the needs of African countries.
And just finally, Richard, yesterday we, of course, saw US President Joe Biden and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping meeting on the sidelines. Any other bilaterals or other meetings that we should be aware of taking place on the sidelines?
Well, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa will himself be meeting with a Chinese delegation later this afternoon, during which there's hopes that there will be additional funding secured for development projects in South Africa and the African continent. There's also been bilateral meetings taking place all morning here between countries largely pushing for a collateral decision with regards to Russia's actions in Ukraine. France has just been meeting with China to discuss that very issue. The UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will also be pointedly pushing for more international cooperation on that issue. So too the European Council, with all of the various members that they'll be meeting. But I think the key thing to look for with regards to South Africa's interests is Cyril Ramaphosa's efforts to try to secure a commitment from other countries towards not just climate change accountability, but specifically towards understanding the mechanisms by which that's affecting developing nations, particularly in Africa, and why extra funding, or at least a guarantee of promised funding to those countries, should be met without hesitation, simply because, in his words, it's taken much longer for many of those countries to recover from COVID-19 than perhaps some of the G7 or most wealthy countries here at the summit that have to a certain extent decided that economically at least they're on the right track to recovery, whereas that's not quite the case for many developing countries around the world.
Oh, Richard Kimber, thanks so much for that update. And Richard Kimber, of course, SABC correspondent in Bali and following those G20 summit talks for us.